So today we're talking some more Doctor Who fandom discourse. I'm aware I'm a good few months late to this particular topic, but hey, it was fun last time, and well, yeah, this is fun. I enjoy this. This is a fun niche. And I do think it's important for me to lend my 2 cents to, for the sole reason that it's been way too commonplace in recent years for Doctor Who fans to be far too militant when it comes to their opinions online. I think we can all agree that a lot of discussions around the show in the online Who space often turn way too sour way too quickly, and you know, it's not nice. At the end of the day, we're talking about a TV show, something we love, something we all have cherished happy memories of, something that's brought so many people together in so many different ways in the name of just having some fun, either writing, making, watching, reviewing, or documenting the adventures of a madman in a box. And well, it sucks to see something that should bring so much joy become such a harsh point of contention for so many people. With that being said, I'm weighing in on some discourse by responding to a video posted by another creator, specifically Mr. Tardis. And I brought that up at the start to basically make it clear that even though yes, I am making a response to some opinions from another creator that I disagree with, no, this is not some big grandiose expose piece on Mr. Tardis or something. I'm not here to sell you this ironclad Mr. Tardis hit piece that destroys his opinions with facts and logic to make me come out the bigger man or any of that bullshit. Mr. Tardis is a creator that I really like. Out of all the YouTubers I watch, he's one of the ones I watch the most. From the episode reviews to the Big Finish reviews and the discussion videos, I love his stuff. Like, up until recently when my financial situation changed, I was a patron. Like, no, really, I was.
And I'd like to give a shout out to these particular patrons: Anne Neubauer, Andrew, Dean Jones, Andrew Blewett, Evil Dalek 79, Finley Rude, GeorgeIsLost.
That's me.
And when I can, I fully intend to become a patron again. The only beef Mr. Tardis should conceivably have with me at all could only be the awkward, jarring way I introduced myself to him at the BFI back in November. Sorry about that, by the way, if you're watching. It's so funny, like, even though the turnout was mostly just small, niche YouTubers with maybe around 20k subs max, I was genuinely starstruck. So, to hammer it in, this video is not an attack on Mr. Tardis. All it is a simple opinion-based discussion and nothing more, like anything else fandom related. Mr. Tardis put out some opinions, and I also had some opinions, so now I'm sharing them and discussing them. Simple as. No hate, no animosity, just a nice chill discussion about my thoughts on his thoughts on other people's thoughts. Yeah, we clear? We good? Alright, let's go. So, some of you probably remember at the end of last year, Doctor Who Flux aired over the span of 6 weeks. I don't know, maybe you remember it, maybe not. It was this niche small thing, not a lot of people know about it. It's no big deal, you might not. If you do, you might also remember on New Year's Day, the episode Eve of the Daleks also aired, and what, you remember that too? Whew, you are on fire today. Why am I coming in like this? 2 episodes from this short period gave rise to a big discussion about plot armor in the show. Now, for those who don't know, plot armor in media essentially means a character being magically protected from being killed or seriously hurt when realistically they probably should be, for the sake of progressing the story. An iconic and often cited example would be the whole Stormtrooper aim thing, where in Star Wars the Stormtroopers, despite being trained soldiers, have terrible aim because if they didn't and hit all their targets, our heroes would die very quickly and we'd have no story. And the episodes that sparked this whole thing were firstly Chapter 2 of Flux, War of the Sontarans, a Silurian story set on Earth during their reign over the planet, in which they're locked in an interplanetary equivalent of the Cold War with Ice Warrior ruled Mars, edging ever closer to pushing a button and annihilating each other, and the Silurian leader this whole time was a Sontaran in disguise, and it was this whole plan because Doctor Who just cannot resist putting spoilers in the episode titles. Okay, I promise I'll stop now. And also Eve of the Daleks, the first story after Flux in which the TARDIS needs to recover from the events of Flux, so after landing our heroes in a storage warehouse, it starts messing up and causes a time loop, which the Daleks take advantage of to try and hunt down the Doctor. Now, most of this video will be in reference to Eve of the Daleks, since that's what Mr. TARDIS mainly focuses on in his video that I'll be responding to, but both War and Eve have similar scenes in which the plot armor is a problem. In War, Companion Dan is transported back to contemporary Earth, yet little does he know it's been taken over by the Sontarans. He's caught out in the street by a group of them, so they chase him and try to shoot at him. And despite Dan not running very fast and running in pretty straight lines, the Sontarans also being mere feet away from him and there being no obstacles, and the Sontarans having been established time and time again throughout the show to be some of the most powerful, ruthless and effective soldiers in the galaxy, since, you know, their whole deal is that they're all about war, it's what their entire race is bred for, they proceed to completely miss every single shot. And in Eve, these Daleks have been equipped with these powerful, very high rate of fire, basically machine gun equivalents of their usual blasters. And for the most part in this story, using their powerful new guns, they're able to successfully mow down our main cast multiple times in this story, the only reason they survive being the time loop nature of the story. And yet there's still a couple scenes where the characters are stuck in a pretty narrow corridor, and these Daleks, again, mere feet away, nothing blocking their shots, but every single shot from them still manages to miss. So just get this in here real quick since I'm not doing an actual review. In terms of my actual thoughts on Eve of the Daleks overall, I did kinda like it. I enjoyed it for what it was. Like, it was the Doctor Who storiest Doctor Who story that ever Doctor Who storied. Like, the most okay story ever, which is honestly a bit of a step up from how much I've liked most of Chibnall's era. But Aisling B was fun. Her character was probably one of the better written Chibnall side characters, and her performance was probably the highlight. The idea was intriguing, though the novelty for it wears off pretty quickly because the script doesn't really play around with the time loop idea and its implications as well as it could have done. And the ways in which the story allowed itself to have a little fun, like with how odd the character of Nick was and all the weird stuff that could be found in the different storage units, I did appreciate all that. There's also the Phasmin thing, which I'm gonna be honest, I haven't even fully formed my opinion on it yet. That's a whole other can of worms, to be honest. But I don't know, it was one of Chibnall's better episodes, but even so, it really wasn't anything spectacular. It was okay. Now, if you followed me on Twitter since around when these episodes aired, if you haven't, now is the perfect time to start, I assure you. You'll know that I was critical of these aspects of the episodes when they came out, and I remember interacting with multiple accounts in the online Who fandom circle who also had critiques of them. And I think it's important to make this distinction. Criticising a piece of media simply for the fact that it has plot armour in it, I agree, is silly, yes. And this is also the sentiment Mr. Tardis echoes in this video, which is an upload of a clip from one of his streams in which he And this is also the sentiment Mr. Tardis echoes in this video, which is an upload of a clip from one of his streams in which he shares his thoughts on the issue. But with some of the things he goes on to say, he portrays this whole thing as though all anyone said about it was that plot armour is in and of itself bad, and all the people saying this were saying so in bad faith, like there's no more nuance at all to this topic. So I'm going to be going through the video and just giving my thoughts on some of the things he has to say. And before we do, let me make something perfectly clear. Everything I'm about to say is just my opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. When it comes to what you think of media and what you get out of it, it is all subjective. All I'm offering here are my subjective takes on the discussion. Do not take anything I say like I am trying to spit facts. I am merely spitting opinions. There we go. Now put up your dukes, Mr. Tardis. Come on, put 'em up, put 'em up. I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get.
A brawl is surely brewing. And begin!
Now, the video is nearly 23 minutes long, but we're skipping to just over 10 minutes in, because other than one little thing that I'll come back to when it's relevant, everything he says up to the point I'm about to play, I have absolutely no disagreements with, no problems whatsoever. It's all fine up to here, but it's at this point, just over the 10-minute mark, where my own personal grievances start to come up, and it's surrounding Mr. Tardis' points about the plot armour criticism.
Oh, I think that pointing out plot armour is not inherently an issue. Pointing it out is not a problem. But basing an entire opinion or a viewpoint or a criticism against the media in question based on the plot armour, that's dumb. That's where I draw the line. Because once you start the line there, where does it end? Point it out. But if that's the straw that breaks the camel's back for you, I'm sorry, I won't take you seriously.
So throughout the remainder of the video, he does give multiple reasons for this take that I'll be getting into, the following one being the main one that I personally really don't get.
I don't have an issue with pointing it out. I have an issue with people basing fundamental criticisms on a key tenet of storytelling. Like kind of the idea that, in war stories, realistically, the protagonist would die by the end of the first act, whether it's a bullet through the head or dysentery on the battlefield or something. But they don't, because there's no story if they don't.
So obviously I don't have access to Mr. Tardis' Twitter account, at least not while this discourse was all going on anyway. So it's entirely possible that he was seeing plenty of people whose point just amounted to plot armour bad. But personally, from what I saw, and I interact with and follow plenty of prominent Who fan accounts, people weren't really saying that the plot armour in these episodes was bad in and of itself, more that the way in which it was done was bad, which in my opinion is perfectly valid, but a take that Mr. Tardis never really addresses classes. And here is where I kind of want to bring in an important concept: good plot armor versus bad plot armor, which I definitely believe does exist and is something to take into consideration. In this context, I suppose good plot armor would be when the story's done a good job immersing you in it, and what plot armor is there is subtle and believable enough that you can just look past it, or that you might not even notice it on your first viewing or even first few viewings. Whereas bad plot armor, on the other hand, would be plot armor that's so obvious and so outlandish that it immediately jumps out at you, breaks your immersion, and you're left thinking, what the hell was that? And obviously anyone can think what they like, but to be honest, I think if you're watching something and some bad plot armor does take you out of the story and make you like it less, that's perfectly valid, and it's not really fair to say, well, that's dumb and not valid criticism, so nut up and shut up and keep watching. That doesn't feel fair to me, I'm sorry. Since Mr. Tardis brought up as an example a war story, I'd like to play around with it and what good or bad plot armor could mean in that context. Now, it's kinda weird to me to say that realistically characters would be dead by the end anyway, because I mean, you know, war veterans are a thing that exist. Like, obviously when you enter a war, you enter a dangerous, unpredictable hellfire, but soldiers do make it to the end of their campaigns with stories to tell, so of course they aren't necessarily guaranteed to die, but I mean, that's something we could argue back and forth about all day and doesn't really help here. Let's say it's a World War I story, and we're monitoring two soldiers huddled down in a trench, with a battle raging just beyond our field of view. Maybe shells are landing nearby, bullets striking the earth nearby, and the two soldiers trying to comfort each other and formulate their plan to make it to the other side alive together. The plot armor simply being that the bullets and shells that are raining down simply aren't hitting them. This, I would argue, is good plot armor. If we cast our minds back to the infamous trench warfare of World War I, we're dealing with rough, uneven terrain, barriers set up by the soldiers to take cover behind, trenches soldiers dug themselves into, and decent distances between opposing sides in the case of, say for example, No Man's Land. Basically, it wasn't super easy to bang on hit all of your targets every time. Now obviously the realm of believability is an abstract concept and will completely differ depending on who you are, but I think here in this example there's plenty of in-universe justification as to why the soldiers aren't just instantly having their brains splattered all over each other within the first 5 seconds. Plus obviously, when it comes to surviving in a war zone, luck is always going to be at least somewhat a factor, which honestly I have a feeling is why Mr. Tardis chose this example in the first place. But even so, there can still be justifications for how a character survives that don't just amount to sheer dumb luck and boost the odds in their favour, i.e. a soldier who makes sure to consistently stay behind cover, keep a constant lookout for enemies, thinks very hard about each of their next moves, versus a soldier who pushes their luck and without much thought just charges into the fire, guns blazing. Like, yeah, luck is still going to be a factor, but I think you can tell me statistically which of these is most and least likely to be killed here. Anyways, back to our two soldier characters hunkering down in a bunker. Wait, no, a trench. I mean a trench. So in this hypothetical situation between hypothetical characters, say they're trying to comfort each other because they're both panicking and breaking down, they're trying to plan their way out of the nightmarish hellscape they're in. But we can also constantly hear the battle raging in the background, maybe we actually see the bullets and shells landing all around, and even better, can actually frequently see soldiers being gunned down and blown up all around our characters. Not only does the audience have something to divert their attention towards, that being the conversation, but it also reinforces how dangerous the environment still is rather than just playing it off through use of us seeing the rain of shells and bullets and lots of other soldiers dying around them. The environment still feels extremely dangerous, yet because of how they're hunkering down and forming a plan, we know what they're doing and it doesn't innately feel like they're surviving by a miracle. Unlike how it does when the Doctor and co can just run away from a Dalek that's rapidly firing at them in a narrow corridor and just happen to not get hit by any of them. Though again, you may all disagree. Again, this is all subjective stuff here. Obviously, I'm not an expert, seasoned media analyst. I didn't study this shit in uni or anything. I'm just some dude who likes Doctor Who, but I think that shows well enough an example of plot armor woven in decently. An example of bad plot armor in this hypothetical World War I story, however, would be if one of the soldiers decides, fuck this, gets up out of the trench, and while all his comrades are still knuckling down in the trench, charges alone across No Man's Land towards the enemy. All the enemy soldiers are shooting directly at him as he gets closer and closer to them. Shells are raining down all around him, and he leaps down into the enemy trench and starts murdering all their shit up, all while without getting a single scratch on him. That would be an example of bad plot armor. and I think I know which of those two reminds me more of the examples from the show we're talking about here. The point I'm trying to make here is that you can make a distinction between plot armor being fine and plot armor actually being done badly and being taken out of the story because of that, and from what I saw, I'm pretty sure that's what people online were mostly trying to say, rather than just, there is plot armor, therefore it is bad. Plot armor isn't bad by default, but if the viewer's immersion suffers for it, if it's distracting enough to make me remember that this is a fictional story written by flawed human writers, then that story and those writers have failed. At least for me anyway. Immersion is key, and that's subjective for everyone. It's all about how it makes you feel, you know? How does it make you feel? Or something, or whatever.
I can't even imagine a universe where I would consider plot armor in that capacity to be a significant issue. But I think if it's anything more than just an observation or a line, maybe even something tongue-in-cheek, I think if it's anything more than that, then you're maybe either watching the wrong show or your internal criteria is a little bit skewed in terms of what your suspension of disbelief is. It's like you could get angry at a piece of media, like you're in a cinema watching the screen, and all of a sudden you think, this isn't immersive, because if I look to the left, it's just a wall. Like, the screen's there, but if I look, I'm not watching Dune anymore. This is just projected on a screen. That kills my immersion. Like, obviously, some media can, of course, take the mick, but I still think it's not worth getting bent up about, especially if there's actual story structure reasons or something to do with dialogue or characterization. Like, yeah, and I'm sorry, Tom Monty, when you say in the Eve of the Daleks it was utterly ridiculous, I don't know what to tell you. Like,
this is what bothers me the most, because Mr. Tardis does to an extent acknowledge that this kind of thing can vary from person to person, and hell, even people in the chat are saying what I am, that it's not an inherent problem, but certain examples can go way too far. But there's no attempt to acknowledge that not all plot armor is created equal, and that like anything in media, it can be well done or poorly done. So instead, all we're getting is this sweeping generalization that talking about plot armor being immersion breaking is akin to saying your immersion is broken when you look away from the screen, and that's a point against the film, followed by him admitting that sometimes it can take the piss, but still downplaying it, which I personally don't agree with and don't think is all that fair. I really think there is something to be said for the validity of badly done plot armor taking you out of a story. If that is how you feel, and I know I did, that's perfectly valid to me. We're all going to get different things out of the media we consume, and if we do just simply engage with plot armor existing at all being a complaint and how silly that is, sure. But I think when you look any deeper and engage with the fact that when people say the plot armor on display in Eve of the Daleks was so bad, that's not all they were trying to say, and that what they are trying to say shouldn't be brushed off as this empty, weightless criticism, when honestly it did impact their enjoyment of the story and took them out of it. Plot armor is inherent to the nature of storytelling, yes, but just like anything in storytelling, it can be done well and it can be done badly. Now, there's another quite interesting point he makes about certain things inherently being plot armor by nature of the story, and I'd like to weigh in on that a little bit too. If you don't really know what I mean, here.
When people were using it for Eve of the Daleks as well, it's a time loop story. Plot armor is the device, the mechanic that stops them from dying. Plot armor is the root of those stories, of time loop stories. Groundhog Day is plot armor because they revive. Happy Death Day, plot armor. To an extent, the Doctor having the sonic screwdriver in his possession is plot armor. The Doctor going and landing in a location at the beginning of the story to save the day means that every supporting character in that story technically has plot armor because the Doctor came along and saved them, dropped from the sky in the magical blue box. Like, marking regeneration as plot armor. Yeah, it is. Like, it's just fiction. It's fiction. Like, sometimes these mechanics exist in fiction to continue the story.
To be fair, people have been complaining about the sonic screwdriver and how overused it is and how it becomes suddenly capable of doing more and more things as the show progresses for years, like as long as I can remember since I've been in this online Who space. Personally, I think, yeah, that can perfectly fall into the category of bad plot armor, since sometimes it can just randomly have a new ability to get the Doctor out of any situation. Regeneration, however, is that plot armor? Well, yes and no. And this brings me to another point I wanted to make. I think another distinction you can make is the one between plot armor and an established rule within the universe or story a piece of media takes place in. In terms of the first Doctor's regeneration, the ability wasn't something that had already been established anywhere in the show, unless you count the fact that he was established to be an alien, but at the time that's all we knew, and it does come out of nowhere. So I guess you could maybe argue that that is plot armor. However, there's of course the fact that it was needed as William Hartnell's health was failing him at the time, so it was no longer good for him to keep playing the Doctor and they had to find a replacement. Plus, it does actually serve an important function that's not just lol, our character didn't die, we're all good now, moving on. In the context of the Whoniverse, it serves the function of advancing the overall story by introducing new key lore, the concept of regeneration. Like, sure, it wasn't planned from the get-go, but in the context of the show's universe, it's still an integral step forward that makes it more than just a bit of plot armor. And from that point onwards, so the second Doctor's regeneration up until all the ones we've had till now, I'd say that no, they're definitely not plot armor. Because from then on, it's become an established rule in the show's universe. When the Doctor or other Time Lords are fatally injured, they regenerate. That is definitively how Time Lords function. You could still make the argument that it's plot armor anyway, because it does allow them to essentially cheat death, and I probably can't refute that because you aren't exactly wrong. But I'ma try to anyway. While yes, the Doctor does always still survive thanks to regeneration, it is essentially still a death of that particular incarnation. It is still the mark of that particular Doctor's story and arc being drawn to a close and a new central character taking up the mantle. Since while yes, the Doctors are all still the same person, they are all still different characters. Or they're all the same character but different people? I don't know, that's a weird one. But the point being that functionally, while the Doctor as a concept does live on, they are still essentially deaths. And wow, would you look at that, suddenly Ten's angry monologue in the end of time suddenly makes so much more sense. But yeah, I do think that's another important distinction to make when it comes to plot armor and whether it's good or bad, especially with something like regeneration. Does it hinge on an established rule? Was it something that had previously been set up? Let's go back to our hypothetical World War I story, in which our soldier character jumps out of the trench and charges across the entirety of no man's land towards the enemy all by himself without getting hit by a single bullet or shell. If this hypothetical story is now a sci-fi story, and we saw at the beginning that an alien spaceship crashed to Earth around the time the war started, the government found it, used the tech within to build wearable force fields that deflect all bullets, and earlier in the story we see this given to the soldier in question, and he's told, you must use this when the time is right, young grasshopper. Yeah, apparently World War I soldiers were being mentored by Master Shifu. And before his charge across no man's land, we see him activate it, then suddenly it's entirely changed. Would you then be able to make a case that that's still plot armor? I don't think you could. And even if you could, it's still nowhere near as egregious and much easier to let slide because it was set up earlier in the story and hinges on an established story element. And not gonna lie, I kind of want to see this movie now.
It's a time loop story. Plot armor is the device, the mechanic that stops them from dying. In Eve of the Daleks, plot armor is the story conceit.
Personally, I don't know if I can agree with the notion that time loops in a story are inherently plot armor. I think it boils down to how they're used and ties back to what I was talking about in terms of established rules. If you've got a story where for the majority of the runtime there's been no mention whatsoever of time loops, but near the end a character dies and just as they're killed a time loop happens out of nowhere saving them and then there's no more time loops again in the story, I do think that that would be plot armor and specifically an example of bad plot armor. However, in the case of Eve of the Daleks, the time loops and how they function were established right from the get-go and we repeatedly see how they function and how the characters are forced to work around them. They're baked into the foundation of the story, making them in my opinion not plot armor but an established rule of the narrative that serves a specific and laid out function. And speaking of how they work in Eve, I want to touch on the fact that like Mr. Tardis says, their aim is pinpoint accurate most of the time and only missing horribly in a couple of scenes.
Because I've watched the episode like 5 times, I've seen the clips that people have been posting. It's 2 scenes. It's 2 scenes, 2 moments, in a story where the main cast are killed 9 times. Or maybe 8 times. Either way, that's an 80-ish% success rate. You don't claim bad Dalek aim in a story where they hit their targets 80% of the time.
Now that is 100% true, but I don't know, for me that almost kind of makes it worse. Like, when a lot of the time these Daleks are super accurate, but then there's these odd scenes here and there where they miss terribly and there's no reason why they shouldn't, it makes those scenes stand out even more and makes them all the more distracting. And again, immersion is key, and the more distracting the bad plot armor is, the more likely it is to break immersion. I also find it really odd where we've got a story where characters can be killed off at any time and essentially respawn, but with less time to work with each go, which could be really suspenseful. But then even though the script has that really useful tool to work with, Chibnall still opts to use this bad plot armor to hold off on killing characters until it feels most convenient for him. I think it would have been so much more effective if these Daleks really did never miss, really were as hyper accurate as the script wants us to believe, consistently throwing spanners in the works at really inopportune times and making things harder and harder for our characters. Like, imagine if in this scene in the corridor when the Dalek misses all of them, if instead it did manage to hit at least one of them, or maybe two or more, and the remaining ones do escape, but now they're missing some of their key players and have to work under so much more stress with less resources. Or hell, maybe it does kill all of them at a time when they really needed to get away, meaning the next reset is a mad frantic scramble to try and race to get everything done that they need to, but with less time. It really could have heightened the sense of tension, it could have been so suspenseful, and I mean it would have been harder to write, but I just don't think that Chibnall, while I'm sure he's a perfectly lovely man, is that good of a writer in my opinion. But that's the most frustrating thing about the bad plot armor in Eve for me. It didn't need to be that way.
I also think that if you complain about plot armor for bad aim, but you are exclusively only talking about examples within the Jodie Whittaker era, that says more about your criticism and your priorities than it does about the media that you're criticising. I'm listening to loads of Big Finish. Plot armor is everywhere in Big Finish. I see no one talk about it, because it's not cool, or you don't get much social media clout for criticising Big Finish plot armor, but you do for complaining about Sontaran bad aim. If you point out plot armor in something that you clearly have maybe an ideological bias against, but you don't point it out in other cases, then I don't honestly believe that you consider it a real issue. I don't. I think you're picking and choosing. Yeah, plot armor discussions for Eve of the Daleks, that was bad faith. Oh, that was bad faith.
These are the last bits I'm going to cover before I wrap this up. I just want to say I really don't like this whole jumping to the only reason people are talking about the plot armor and war in Eve were because either more clout or because of the whole ideological bias or bad faith thing. I mean, we've seen the darker sides of the fandom. I'm pretty sure there are people who harped on them for that. You know, the usual suspects. But branding everyone making points about plot armor in with that seems wild to me. And also it's like, yeah, we could talk about plot armor in previous New Who episodes or in Big Finish stories or ever, but we weren't talking about those. That's not what the discussion was about. Like, I'm sure the majority of people making these points would find those other examples just as egregious, and I'm sure if someone started a discussion about those other stories, those points would be brought up. But we're fans who follow Doctor Who's every move, and even War were each the brand new Doctor Who TV stories at the time, so like, of course we were talking about those. Of course that's what the discussion was about. They were the brand new current thing at the time. Why wouldn't we be discussing them? And I mean, like, yeah, you can bring up examples of bad plot armor in other stories. Again, specifically bad plot armor, because I do agree, just criticising the fact that plot armor is present at all is pretty dumb. But even so, if the bad plot armor critique is one you agree with, being shown examples of it in other stories doesn't magically render that critique null and make it go away. And there we go. There's my thoughts on the discussion. So obviously, to Mr. Tardis, no hard feelings whatsoever, absolutely zero malintent on my part. I do still love your content, like honestly, these videos of you tackling and debunking all the hateful misinformation that's out there, so good, and so much stuff that a lot of people really do need to hear, so please never stop making those. And as for the rest of you, if you agree, cool. If you don't agree and think I've just waffled out my arse this whole time and think Mr. Tardis is completely right, that's absolutely fair, nothing wrong with that. Again, this is all just opinions. In terms of War of the Sontarans and Eve of the Daleks, the whole plot armor thing really isn't a massive deal anyway. Like, there's so much more important and significant stuff about them to either criticize or praise. Like, it really isn't a massive deal at all, even though, yeah, I'm aware I did just rant about it for 20 minutes. But I only wanted to get this out there because I felt a certain way about a couple of recent episodes, and some of the things that Mr. Tardis said here came across as basically saying that these feelings were invalid, and I wanted to share why I personally disagree. And that's all there is to it. If you do have any thoughts you'd like to weigh in with, please do in the comments below, and I'm gonna dip out now because as of writing this and seeing just how much there is, I'm dreading finding out how long this shit's gonna be. Also, I'm aware that in this, I chopped up Mr. Tardis' video pretty heavily, so if you want to make sure that I'm not taking anything out of context, then please, I implore you, go and watch the original video, link in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, all you BEA beautiful people, however many or few of you there may be, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!